Good evening. Welcome to this week's lecture, which is on party systems, voters and campaigning in Britain. And our lecturer this week is Justin Fisher, who is Professor of Political Science, Politics and History at Brunel University. In addition to that role, he is the Director of the Magna Carta Institute and also head of the School of Social Sciences at Brunel. And in the way of earlier seminars, lectures in this series, he'll speak for about an hour, and then we'll have an opportunity for some questions at the end.
Thank you, Tony. So what I'd like to do today is cover a series of aspects about British party systems and the impact of electoral systems before seeing how all of this interacts with the success of campaigning in general elections. And I'll start with party systems in the UK. Now, by necessity, because we're limited by time, I'm going to focus principally on Westminster. But the general argument that's made about British party systems is that there are several, not only at Westminster, but also at the devolved level, the European level, and the London level. But I'm going to focus mainly here in terms of Westminster. And what we can see here is share of the vote at UK level for all of the elections since the Second World War. And some very clear patterns you can see here. First, the decline in the share of the vote for the largest two parties, Conservative and Labour, and the rise of certainly the Liberal Democrats and their predecessor parties, and the other parties, Greens, UKIP, and their predecessors. If we look in terms of share of the seats, we see a similar pattern, but it's far less pronounced. The main thing to point out here is the big change in 1997. So 1997 is often regarded principally as the election where Labour won a landslide, and that, of course, is absolutely true. But in terms of modern British politics, the other very significant thing about 1997 was the very significant increase in the number of seats held by the Liberal Democrats. So prior to that, they were bobbing along around the 23, 24 mark in terms of seats. They went to 46 and have experienced almost continuous growth at Westminster level ever since. They dipped back a little in 2010, but nevertheless, from 97 onwards, they've become an established part of the British Westminster scene. Now, these data tell us tell a nice story, and they tell largely the textbook story of the change in British politics, particularly since the 1970s. But actually, there's a rather more accurate way of calculating the degree of change. And there are several measures of this, but perhaps the most effective is usually the most simple one. And that's something called the effective number of electoral parties and the effective number of parliamentary parties. And this is a measure which allows us to test the change over time and the extent to which a party system has deviated from a dominant two-party system towards a multi-party system. And the important figure here in this calculation is 2. Anything above 2 is a degree of multi-partism. Anything below 2 suggests one-party dominance. Now, the calculation for this is straightforward. It's 1 over the sum of the share of the individual parties in terms here of vote share, but it will be share of the seats as well if you do the effective number of parliamentary parties squared. So in 2010, if we regard all of the others, if we bunch them together, we get the following. So 36% Conservative, 29% Labour, 23% Liberal Democrat, and 12% others. And that gives you a score of 3.55. Now, that on its own is not terribly helpful. It gives you an indication of how far we've moved from a straight two-party system. But you can visualize this best if you calculate these scores for each election. And as you can see, over time, from 1951 onwards, there's almost continual growth. So at 2010, we have the most multi-party Westminster elections ever. There are ebbs and flows, but by and large, the picture is going up. So on the basis of vote share, it would seem that Britain has moved from two-party to multi-party. However, The mistake people often make when thinking about elections is to focus only on vote share. And actually what really matters, particularly in a system like the UK's, first past the post, is seats. Okay? Because there are no prizes for second place under the British system, so it's seats that make the real difference. And as we see, if we calculate the effective number of parliamentary parties using the same methodology but substituting using share of the seats rather than share of the votes, there has been a growth of multi-partiness, but the growth is far less constant and far less significant. And according to this calculation, we're only at about 2.6. So even though we have a significant number of Liberal Democrats, we even have a Green MP, and so on and so forth, in terms of seats, we're still much more dominated by the two principal parties. Now, the interesting thing is one thesis about 2010 is that it may have been the high point of multi-partism at Westminster, because there are several pieces of evidence that suggest when we come into the next election in 2015, we may have the trends that we've seen in the previous graphs may be reversed. And I'd highlight three pieces of evidence to support that argument. The first is monthly poll ratings. I'm sorry, it's not, for some reason, we're not getting the title.
We've done this before.
Right.
I must get the machine sacked. Sorry.
Okay. What I've got here are monthly poll ratings from the general election of 2010 up until the latest ones in November 2013 from Mori. I've used a technique called smoothing, which is simply a way of taking the big spikes out of the data and it's easier to visualize what's going on. Now the pattern here is fairly easy to see. Labour and the Conservatives have bobbed along, mirroring each other's movements pretty well, but the key change has been the collapse relative to 2010 in terms of the Liberal Democrats' poll rating. So whereas they secured 23% of the vote in the election in 2010, they're now bobbing around on consistently around 9 or 10% in the polls. Now, those who argue that the Liberal Democrats are not in crisis will always say, and they would have said this in the past with some reason, with some good reason, that actually it doesn't matter how the Lib Dems do in between elections. What matters is that they get publicity at general elections, and that usually increases their vote share. And indeed, that was borne out. You get a pattern in general elections when people start talking about the Lib Dems, that more people start liking them. The problem this time is that the Liberal Democrats are being spoken about all the time, of course, because they're in coalition. So that kind of fallback position may not apply. But if that was the only piece of evidence, I think we would be rightly sceptical that there's some sort of problem for the third party in British politics. So I've got two other pieces of evidence that suggest there might be something in this Lib Dem problem. The first is the share of councillors at GB level that the Lib Dems hold. My start point here is 1988, when the Liberal Democrats were formed through a merger of the STP and the Liberal Party, up until the most recent elections in May 2013. And the pattern is pretty clear. The trend is pretty clear. The Lib Dems are back where they started in 1988. And that, for a Lib Dem, was a pretty bad place to be. Because those of you who are old enough to remember the 1989 European elections, for example, were, if you like, the low point of the Liberal Democrats. Because the Liberal Democrats in those elections came fourth behind the Greens. And as an indicator of how badly you're doing, if you're falling behind the Greens, you're doing pretty badly. So, in terms of shares of councillors, the Lib Dems are back where they were 25 years ago. And that's not a good indicator for their fortunes. Well, it doesn't suggest that they're well placed in 2015. Now, of course, people vote for parties for different reasons at different levels of government. But nevertheless, consistently, we've seen a pattern whereby parties have done well over time at local level that ultimately tends to be repeated at national level and vice versa. Equally, if we look at the share of GB councils over the same period, the same story applies. The Lib Dems are back where they started 25 years ago. So these three pieces of evidence based on poll ratings, based on number of councillors, based on based on control of councils, suggests that we may have hit a high point of multipartism. And it may be the fact that rather than keeping going, that first graph continuing to go up, it may well take a significant dip in 2015. Now, I mentioned devolution earlier because I think it's important to also establish, and this takes us into the next part of my talk, about the potential impact of different levels of government and different electoral systems. So what I've got here is a calculation of the effective number of parliamentary parties in Scotland. Now, this combines both general election data in the various general elections over the period with elections to the Scottish Parliament. And I started in 1974 February because that's the first year in which the Scottish National Party fielded a candidate in every seat, thereby that point really is the birth of modern Scottish politics. And what we're interested in here is the effective number of parliamentary parties comparing the Westminster elections with those for the parliamentary elections. And as you can see, after 1997, the peaks in 1999, 2003, 2007, and to a lesser extent 2011 are rather higher than they are for Westminster level elections. In other words, what we see in Scotland is the clear influence of different levels of government, suggesting a different party system. Of course, the SNP is more popular at Scottish level than at Westminster level, but equally the impact of an alternative electoral system. So, as you may know, in Scotland they use the additional member system, which has a proportional corrective, and it would seem that that has had an impact on Scottish politics, albeit a slightly diminishing one. The high point was in 2003, but since then the effective number of parliamentary parties has dipped. It's still above Westminster level, but it seems to be falling away. If we look at Wales, we see a similar pattern. Now, the picture in Wales up until 2001 was very much of a one-party state. This was one where Labour was utterly dominant at Westminster level, indicated by the effective number of parliamentary scores falling some way below 2. But as we can see, the introduction of the Welsh Assembly and the use, again, of the additional member system has led to a significant increase in the effective number of parliamentary parties in Wales, at least at Welsh Assembly level. At Westminster level, it's nudging around 2, suggesting now more of a two-party system than a dominant one-party one. But the picture is very different depending on the level of government we're examining. Finally, in terms of devolution, it's interesting to look at Northern Ireland. Again, we start in 1974, for that was the time when the Ulster Unionists stopped taking the Conservative whip and stood as independent parties. And here, again, it's important to make the comparison between what happens at Westminster and what happens at elections to the Northern Ireland Assembly, where the single transferable vote is used. And what we find, not surprisingly, is that again, the effective number of parliamentary parties using a different electoral system and a different level of government increases quite substantially. 1998 is the most obvious example of that. But the other interesting thing here is that high point of multipartism in 1998, it was just that. After that, the effective number of parliamentary parties seems to fall away. And what we've seen in Northern Ireland is something very interesting. STV was was used there precisely because it was seen as a consensual party system, electoral system, an electoral system that's often used for very divided societies. What's in fact happened is that the two parties at the edge of the spectrum, Sinn Féin on the one hand and the Democratic Unionists on the other, have been the parties that have profited from this, and the parties towards the centre, like the Ulster Unionists and the SDLP, have tended to fall away. And it tells us something about electoral systems, that you can change the system as much as you like, but if people want to be divided, they still will be, whatever rules are in place. And that takes us to a more general question. about the impact of electoral systems on voter behaviour. And whereas you'll see a lot in the literature about how electoral systems may influence the outcome of elections, that's something we've touched on here, a perhaps more interesting question is to look at the extent to which electoral systems would seem to shape the behaviour of voters. Now, one of the great mistakes that many bad political scientists make is they transpose the behaviour of voters under one system onto another. In other words, they imagine that voters would behave in exactly the same way whether they were voting under first past the post or a system of proportional representation. Now, this makes no sense whatsoever if you accept or if you hypothesize that the rules of the game may affect how people behave. So rather than just transpose the results, we need to test whether or not voter behavior is affected by the system used. And the hypothesis one might test is as follows, that voters' behavior would change under different electoral systems because voter choice is either constrained by a system like first past the post, you can only put one X, or liberated by any other electoral system that's in place. So of course other systems may use rank ordering or may allow you to vote twice, such as in Ams elections. Now, underlying this hypothesis are two assumptions that we really need to test if we're to try and establish whether or not electoral systems make any difference. And the first of these is that we may assume that voter choice will be constrained in a system like first past the post because in effect there are only likely to be two winners, certainly at constituency level. So the vast majority of seats at constituency level in Britain are two-party contests. Most are either con-Lab, con-Lib Dem, and a growing number of Lab-Lib Dem seats. The number of three-party seats, where any one of three parties could reasonably expect to win, is very, very small. And so for most voters, their choice is constrained if they want to back a winner at that level, at that election. Coupled with that, at national level, notwithstanding the coalition we have presently, in most elections, certainly, well, in all elections since the Second World War, with the exception of the most recent one, there's only likely to be one of two victors. It's either going to be a Conservative government or a Labour government. So the argument here, or the assumption here that we want to test, is that voter choice is constrained. In other words, the system, because it produces these kinds of outcomes, two-party contests, it's likely to shape how people will behave. The second assumption that underlines many discussions about the impact of electoral systems is that you can use whatever voting system you want, but that actually voters are committed to certain parties. And that ideological commitment, that partisan commitment, someone seeing themselves as a Labour man or a Conservative woman or whatever, is unlikely to affect how people behave in the ballot box. In other words, if you're voting under an AMS election, if you're a Conservative, you'll vote Conservative with your first vote and Conservative with your second. And if you're offered the rank order, say of AV, you'll simply put your favourite party first and maybe not bother with the second, third or fourth options. So these assumptions we need to test. So how do we test them? Well, there are three ways in essence that we can test some of these ideas. The first is using survey evidence with mock ballots. So what's been done over the last few elections is that we've had mock ballots taken exactly at the time of the election where voters have been invited to vote normally, so to speak, and then vote with a series of different ballot papers. And then we can see how people would behave if they were given the opportunity at exactly the same time to either vote with first past the post or with a variety of other systems. The second one is to look at an increasing pattern in British politics, which is to hold elections concurrently. So since 1997, a pattern has emerged whereby we hold elections on the same day. typically the first Thursday in May. We now have fixed term elections, so that pattern will now be secured. But a pattern has emerged, particularly since 1997, where we hold a series of local elections and the general election on the same day. And that allows us to test whether or not people vote for the same party when they're in the ballot booth at the same, or voting booth at exactly the same time. In other words, this allows us to test the ideological commitment thesis. The third way we can test the assumptions is to look at the results of Ams elections in Britain. Now we have Ams elections in Scotland for the Parliament, for the Welsh Assembly, and also for the Greater London Assembly. And here, where voters have 2 votes, we can again test the ideological commitment argument to see whether or not people will vote for the same party or whether they will split their ticket. So this is an example of some of the survey data. This is from the most recent British election study, and asks people to vote both normally but also in a mock AV ballot. And what we find here is the evidence seems to be mixed. If we just look at Conservative and Labour people, what we're comparing here is whether they would vote in the same way in the first past the post, and if their first choice in AV would be exactly the same. And actually, for Conservative and Labour voters, in 9 in 10 cases, that would be the case. Most voters for those parties would still back them if they had an electoral system where there was a rank order. And of course, this is the system on which we had a referendum about 2.5 years ago. So on the one hand, there isn't so much evidence that voters would vote differently, at least for these 2 parties. But for the Liberal Democrats, the picture is rather different. In that case, 1 in 4 voters would vote differently if they had a different electoral system in place. And interestingly enough, these results are almost exactly the same when the same exercise was run in 2005. So there is some evidence, at least, in terms of survey data, that some voters would behave differently. The key issue for us is whether or not the difference in voter behaviour is as large as we might assume it would be. But there is some evidence, at least, that some voters would behave differently, particularly if they were from supporters of the smaller parties. In terms of concurrent elections, as I said, we're able to test where those elections take place, when those elections take place, if people would vote for the same party when they're voting in the same booth at exactly the same time. And what tests, repeated tests over time, have shown is that there is some evidence of ticket splitting. People are voting for different parties depending on the level of government, even when they're voting at the same point in time. And this undermines the arguments that voters' partisanship would be so strong that they'd never switch sides. So these data, this is one example, but there are plenty of others. This is from 1997, and this looks at the aggregate difference in the share of the vote for the parties, the main parties that stood in 1997 at general level and at local level. And perhaps the most interesting finding here is the last one on turnout. So you've got the same voters being given 2 ballot papers, one for the council, one for the general election, going into the same booth, and yet still 1% of people failed to vote in the local elections. Okay? You couldn't make it any easier for people, and yet they still don't use that other ballot paper. But as you can see, we do get some differences. Now, because these are aggregate data, this shields any underlying movements. Okay? So this is, if you like, a low point, the lowest possible difference that it could be. The differences could be actually much higher. And in various different constituencies, the authors of this study, Rowlings and Thrasher, found as many as 20% of people changing their vote between general and local. But again, just looking at these aggregate data overall, you can see that there's a 2% difference for the Conservatives, 4% for Labour, over 6% for the Lib Dems, REF is the referendum party, for those of you who don't remember 1997, sort of one-man anti-European Union party, and then a difference for the others. So in terms of concurrent elections, again, we get some evidence that the ideological commitment argument may not be as strong as many people have suggested. The third way we can test these assumptions about voter behaviour is to look at AMS elections. Now, as you'll know, under AMS elections, voters cast two ballots, one for the constituency level and one for the regional list. And if voters use both votes, they can either vote for the same party twice, Labour, they can split their ticket, i.e. vote Labour, Lib Dem, and this is particularly important if smaller parties, like say the Greens, only stand in the regional bit rather than the constituency bit. For a party like the Greens, there's no point in standing in the constituency section because they're never going to win. But they stand to gain if they stand in the regional list. And of course, some people may only use one vote. In the 2007 Scottish elections, for example, 50,000 voters only used one of the votes. Even though it's on the same ballot paper, they didn't manage to get to the right-hand side of it and use the second vote. And there is a lesson here for us, because if any of you find yourselves in a position where you're recommending change around the world in electoral systems, keep it simple. Okay? For one thing, voters don't like complicated systems. There's clear evidence of that. And the other thing is, if you use a system like STV, which requires multiple preferences, if people don't use all their preferences, the system doesn't work as well as it should. Now, I don't know about you, I'm not absolutely sure what my fourth favourite party is. But for that system to work, you really need to think about those issues. So, in some ways, an electoral system should be as simple as it possibly can be. And even a very simple one like AMS can cause difficulties. Now, notwithstanding, you take the Scottish Parliament election in 2007, which is just the example I've used here. You could use any number of other elections that have taken place. Again, we see evidence of some ticket splitting, and smaller parties are the beneficiaries. So this looks at the share of the vote at the constituency level and the share of the vote at list level. And as you can see, there are some dramatic differences. So Labour, the difference is 3%, the SNP 2%, but up to 5% for the Lib Dems in terms of differences in the shares of the vote they receive. Conservatives 2.7%, but look at the others, a significant difference of 12%. Suggesting, again, that the ideological commitment argument that suggests that people will only vote for one party, whatever system you put in place, is borne out up to a point. I mean, some of these differences aren't huge, but nevertheless, it undermines that argument, and it does suggest that if you give people more choice, some people will use it. So, just to conclude on electoral systems, there is some evidence, but the key question for you to think about is the difference in behaviour as strong as we might expect. Now, in one sense, you might say, well, if you think about the survey, it's all very well running that survey, but people are used to first past the post. They're not yet used to a system like AV, and after the referendum result 2.5 years ago, they won't get another chance, at least for 20 years. But if you may find that voter behaviour would change over time. But really, if you're going to answer these sorts of questions, you need these various kinds of ways of testing whether or not there is evidence to support the idea that the electoral system would make a difference. And there's some evidence that it would, but it's perhaps not as big as we might think. Okay, the next theme I want to explore, which feeds into the final one, is declining loyalty to parties, or declining loyalties to different parties. And what this concerns is the idea of the change in British politics that really kicked off in the 70s, whereby people's habitual support for one party or another started to crumble away. And the classic way of measuring this is the measure that's used in the British election study of partisan identification. And there are the results of two questions here. The first question, which is illustrated by the blue line at the top, asks people if they feel closer to one party or another. Now, the argument here is that most people will feel closer to one party or another. And this is how we test it. And the analogy really is with people who follow a sport. Okay? So my favoured sport happens to be football. Okay? And those of you who follow football will know that if anyone is watching a game and they say, I don't mind who wins as long as it's the team that plays most attractive football, you know that they don't really like football. Okay? Everybody who watches a game has a team that they want to win. And yours is obviously Brentford. Right? So now, the same, it's argued, is true in politics. Most people will see themselves as being, probably closer to Labour or closer to the Conservatives or nearer the Lib Dems or whatever. And this first line tests that. Now, for sure in the literature you will see some debate about whether or not the question is as well phrased as it could be. But nevertheless, the data suggest that over time, 64 is the start point because that was the first British election study, the data suggest that indeed most people do feel closer to one party or another. It was around 95% in 1964. It's now reached the plummeting depths of around 83%. But still, 4 in 5 people say they feel closer. The key line for the argument about the decline in loyalties to parties is the red line. Okay, so the red line, the other lines on the graph test how strong that commitment is. So they take the people who say, yes, I feel closer to Labour, the Lib Dems, whatever, and then they say, well, how strong is your commitment? Okay, and there are 3 lines, the very strongs, the fairly strongs, and the not very strongs. And to take my football analogy a bit further, the red line, they're the season ticket holders. Okay. The fairly strongs, they're the people who go to about 7 or 8 games a season. And then the green lines, they're the people who look out on final score for how the team's done. And as you can see, the red line plummets in the 1970s and has been going downhill ever since. So whereas in the 1960s, around 50% of voters who were partisan, and remember that's about 95% of all voters, were dyed-in-the-wool Tories, dyed-in-the-wool Labour voters. In 1964, you wouldn't talk about a dyed-in-the-wool Liberal. There were very few of them. Okay? Similarly, the green line, the not very strongs, has gone up to a similar degree. So now, of those people who are partisan, around 37, 38%, I'm kind of Labour, I'm kind of Conservative. So on the basis of that, many people argue that actually voters are much less loyal to parties. And therefore that has several knock-on effects in terms of the potential of short-term impacts. Things like leadership effects, things like media effects, and things, as we see, like campaigning effects. Before we get carried away with that, however, there's one slight caveat. Because the line that no one ever speaks about in this graph, and this is a very famous graph, is the yellow line, the fairly strongs. These are the people who don't describe themselves as dyed-in-the-wool Tories, but they're nevertheless pretty strong. They see themselves very much in one camp. And that line has barely changed over time. So 40% of our identifiers, which is a diminishing number, but still the vast majority of the population, are still fairly strong. So the idea that we're all floating voters, treating each election on its merits, is not completely supported by the data. And there's more grist to the mill here if we look at the impact on volatility. The impact, what difference does that make to voters? Well, we can look at 2 ways of measuring volatility. There may well be more, but these are the 2 most commonly used. We can either use something called net volatility, which is based on aggregate data, the change in election results over time. This is often also known as the Pedestal index. by a very far-sighted political scientist called Morgan Pedestal, who added his name to the index in an act that wasn't vain in the least. I mention this only because my life's ambition as a political scientist is there to be a Fisher index of something, but I've yet to think of what that might be. I will, however, do it at some point. Anyway, Morgan Pedestal has the aggregate volatility, which we'll look at in a sec. We can also look at it in terms of individual level data. These are data from surveys which ask people both how they voted last time and also how they voted this time. So we can measure the proportion of people who've changed sides. Now, there's always a difficulty in this because to do this accurately, you have to have what we call panel data, where you ask the same people at 2 points in time. But the trouble with panel data is that they're incredibly expensive to collect. So sometimes we have to rely on cross-sectional data. And that involves asking someone how they voted 4 years ago. Now, bearing in mind, most people are not absolutely captivated by politics, and they may not be able to remember. Indeed, they may well lie. So some of these data are less accurate than others, but broadly speaking, a pattern will emerge. And what we find is that both of these measures suggest an increase in voter volatility. So as there's been this decline in loyalty to parties, there has been a growth in voters, in people switching around, in changing results. But again, the question is whether the level of volatility or the different levels of volatility reflect the declining loyalty. In other words, would we expect more volatility given the decline in very strong partisans? So this is the Pedestal index of net volatility, and the key thing to look at here is the peaks. Okay? Do the peaks get much bigger? Because of course not every election will be hugely volatile. If you compare 97 with 2001, there's minimal volatility because almost nothing changed. But what we're interested in is the size of the peaks that we find after, say, the 1970s. And there is clear suggestive evidence that those peaks get much higher, suggesting at the aggregate level that there is indeed a growing volatility in British elections. But I'm always slightly suspicious of this index because, of course, it does shield underlying movements if you use aggregate data. So perhaps a better measure, notwithstanding my point about panel and cross-sectional elections, is using individual level data. So this is the percentage of people who switched parties. These are only people who voted in both elections between two elections starting in 1959. And we can see that there has broadly been an increase in volatility, and we see a sharp rise, for example, between 92 and 97, as we might expect. But perhaps there's not quite as much as vote switching as we might anticipate, given the argument that people are becoming less loyal to parties. So there is more volatility, but again, maybe not as much as we might think. But there is another measure that becomes relevant for us. And this is the percentage of what we call late deciders. Now, this is a question that features in the British election study, where people are asked when they decided for which party they would vote. And as you can see, over time, that proportion has increased very significantly. Indeed, it's almost been a constant upward trend. So in 1964, it was only around 12% of people decided to vote during the campaign. And by the campaign, we mean the period from when the Queen dissolves Parliament. But by 2010, we're up to nudging 40%. So a significant proportion of people saying that they decided how they would vote during the campaign. Now, we could, of course, have difficulties with this question. Okay? In a sense, who knows when people decided? But we've asked the same question over time, every election since 1964. So if there is an error, it should be a fairly consistent error. So it's the relative growth that we're interested in rather than the absolute figures. And as you can see, there is a clear pattern emerging that people say that they're deciding later and later. Now, why does that matter? Well, again, that matters because if people are deciding later and later, it means that short-term influences, like leadership debates, like campaigning, like media, and so on and so forth, have the potential at least to have more impact. Which brings me to the last part of my talk, which is on the impact of campaigns at district level. Now, there are in one sense two campaigns that go on at general elections. What we call the ground campaign at constituency level or district level, and the air campaign at national level. But in actual fact, the two are closely intertwined, and arguably the party's national campaign is most closely fought in the constituencies. In other words, as you'll see, there's much clearer evidence that the campaigning that parties do in the constituencies, which may be influenced, which is certainly has the strong involvement of the central parties, has much more of a bearing on the result than poster campaigns or what goes on the television. So what can we see here? Well, as I said, the conditions in British politics make it much more conducive to campaign effectiveness. Partisan identification has declined in intensity, voter hesitancy has increased. And what that means for campaigners is two things. There are more waverers. And there are more waverers certainly to reinforce. But there may well be waverers to convert. Now, when you're thinking about campaigns, some people mistakenly argue that campaigns are only effective if you convert someone from one side to the other. But in fact, to convert someone from being a conservative waverer to voting Lib Dem is quite a Herculean task. It's not something that will be achieved in any great numbers. And instead, most campaigns are not about converting people, but getting people who are leaning to your side to actually firm up and vote for your team. In other words, if you're a Labour campaigner, it's about getting those wobbly Labour voters back in the tent and voting Labour. Ditto Lib Dems. You will convert a few, but you're going to reinforce a whole lot more. And in some of the literature, you'll see this idea that reinforcement is not important. It is important. It's the main thing that you can do in campaigns. As you'll see, if people are less loyal, if they're hesitating more, that means there are more waverers to deal with. So how do we measure campaign strength? Well, since 1992, what various incarnations of this team have done is send a questionnaire to every election agent for the main three parties in Britain, plus the two national parties in Scotland and in Wales. And we send the questionnaire to agents because all candidates by law are required to have an agent. The agent is in charge of all the expenditure, and in general, the agent knows most about how the campaign is conducted. Okay, the agent is in charge of the campaign. So we survey election agents to find out a whole host of details. We ask them about 50 odd questions about their party's level of preparation in the constituency, how well organised they are, have they got people assigned to certain jobs, how many party workers there are, how many people there are on the ground, what types of campaigning they undertake, how many leaflets they distributed, how many posters, and so on and so forth. What kind of canvassing did they do? Did they do it on the doorstep? Did they do it on the phone? How much? And so on and so forth. And also the extent of activity on polling day. Now, one of the very, very important things that parties do on polling day is remind their supporters to vote. And this is, when describing this has been an activity that's got me into some difficulties when talking about it in the States. Because parties use a number of different techniques to do this. And the phrase for getting your supporters out is known as knocking up. And I remember speaking at a conference in the States, and I said, yeah, parties now are not only knocking up on the doorstep, they're knocking voters up by phone, and they're doing it by text. And there were these slightly embarrassed looking Americans and Britain's tittering away. And of course, in my naive way, I thought, oh, why are you laughing? This is constituency campaigning. It was then explained to me by my children what in fact that meant, much to my embarrassment. But of course, I now never fail to use the phrase when I'm giving a paper in the States. But that sort of activity is terrifically important. So it's getting your party workers sitting outside the polling station, finding out who's voted, going around reminding people to vote, so on and so forth. And what we do is we take all the data from the survey and construct a scale of campaign intensity, which allows us to test how well the intensity of campaign is distributed, because parties shouldn't, it's not sensible for parties to campaign equally strongly in all seats, and also allows us to test the effectiveness. Well, I'll start first on the distribution. What we've got here are the scores that we've calculated for the intensity of the campaign. Now, what we do with the scores is we standardize them around a mean of 100. So anything above 100 is more intense than average, anything below is less intense. And then we categorize the type of campaigning done by 3 types of seats. Okay? So parties, first and foremost, will have target seats. These are seats they're seeking to gain from other parties, or seats that they hold with a small majority that they're trying to hold on to under attack from one or more parties. Secondly, they'll have what we call held not targets. This is another term for safe seats. Okay? So a party will have seats, typically in these seats they'll have higher memberships, because there's nothing like success for breeding success. And what they'll tend to do is, rationally they shouldn't run strong campaigns here because they're going to win anyway, but because they have lots of resource there, they often end up doing this. And then what we call not held, not targets. In common parlance, these are hopeless seats. Okay? This is the equivalent of Labour campaigning in Guildford or the Conservatives in Barnsley, okay? Where they're never going to win in a million years. Now, our argument is that a rational party should put most of its effort in its targets, as we would expect, and then we would expect to find, broadly speaking, the next strongest campaigns in their safe seats, their held not targets, because there's resource there and supporters like joining the winning team, and they shouldn't do very much in the held not targets. Now, what these data show is that actually some parties are much better at distributing resource than others. Okay? And Labour and particularly the Liberal Democrats are incredibly good at making the most of what they've got, putting their effort where they really need it. With the exception of 2010, the Conservatives have traditionally had a problem that the difference between the strength of campaigning in their targets has been barely any different than the campaigning in the seats that they're going to hold anyway. And therefore, that gives us a clue as to whether or not the party's strategies are successful. To give you an example, if we take 2010, we see that on average, the Liberal Democrats had the weakest campaigns, okay? A score of 90. But because they're very good at targeting in general, they had very strong campaigns. The strongest, indeed, their campaigns in their target seats were stronger than those campaigns run by either the Conservative Party or the Labour Party. So the key is not so much what you've got on average, but where you put the resource. Now, the problem for parties is that some resources are very mobile. So money is mobile, computers are mobile, professional staff are mobile. Members are less mobile. And much depends on the culture of the party. So Labour has benefited from traditionally being fairly Stalinist in its approach. The centre says, we're going to campaign here, and most members have been pretty good at obeying and going to campaign in other seats that they need to win. The Lib Dems, buoyed by their their by-election success, have had a sort of Lib Dem barmy army that's gone round to the target seats. If you ever go to a by-election, it's packed to the gills with young Lib Dems, terribly enthusiastic, and they're good at it. But the Conservatives, where the culture of the party has been suspicious of the centre because of the historic independence of the local associations, have been much less good at doing this. And the result is that they've been less good at targeting their efforts. People often talk about Lord Ashcroft and his influence on the Conservative Party in terms of finances. But perhaps the greatest gift that Lord Ashcroft has given the Conservative Party is to make them wake up and understand that they have to campaign in the seats that matter, not in the seats that they're going to win anyway. I mean, it sounds obvious, but it's taken the Conservatives a long time to learn. So, what's been the result of that? Well, what we found is that campaigning overall boosts turnout. Okay? Party campaigning is a good thing. Okay? And we should, as good Democrats, resist the temptation to try and restrict it, because campaigning gets people to the ballot box. Secondly, Lib Dem campaigning has consistently boosted its vote share. The more Lib Dems do, the better they tend to do. Okay, and that's partly a function of their good targeting. Labour campaigning has also tended to be very, very effective, with the exception of 2005. I'll come back to why 2005 may have been a problem for Labour. But we find with the Conservatives is that their campaigning was generally ineffective in terms of boosting their share of the vote, except in the 2010 election. 2010 was the election where the Conservatives woke up. But what we've also found is that the impact of campaigning will vary by election. In other words, these are the patterns we've found so far, but they vary in terms of their impact. Broadly speaking, Lib Dem campaigning works. Broadly speaking, Labour campaigning works. But it's not always at the same level. And so in the most recent work that we've done on this, we've come up with a kind of ideal type to capture the variation that we find in the importance of campaigning. What we've got here are 4 items: how close the election is, marginality, that's at a national level, whether or not there's likely to be significant change in terms of who governs, the number of target seats, because the more target seats a party has, the more difficult it is to coordinate and indeed distribute the resource. If you have a large number of target seats, the resource gets spread rather more thinly. And then finally, central management, the extent to which the central party directs the aspirations of the local parties. And then there are conditions where the campaigning will be more or less effective. What we call popularity equilibrium is effectively where parties are at their normal levels of popularity. Nobody is massively popular, nobody is massively unpopular. And where that occurs in a close election, campaigning is more likely to be effective. But if you have one or more unpopular parties, the campaigning will be less effective. Now, to go back to Labour's case in 2005, Labour was pretty unpopular for 2 principal reasons, ones that played into the hands of the Liberal Democrats. Firstly, many Labour supporters were put off by the Iraq War, and secondly, although we may yearn for the days when it was £3,000 for students to study at undergraduate level, Labour had introduced top-up fees. Okay? Again, very unpopular with many people. So where you have a very unpopular party, it makes the campaigning of that party less effective because it's more difficult to get the message across. Equally, if you're fighting against an unpopular party and you're just sort of doing okay, your campaigning is likely to be less effective because you're going to win anyway. If there's significant change, then as we would expect, the campaigning of challengers is likely to be more effective than that of incumbents. So we would point to 2010 in terms of the Conservatives and 1997 in terms of Labour, so after long periods of one-party rule. High numbers of target seats, where you have unpopular parties, an unpopular party or unpopular parties, having a high number of target seats has less importance. Okay? So the targeting so many doesn't have such a detrimental effect on your campaigning. But where there's popularity equilibrium, then the high number of target seats will mean your campaigning is less effective. And then one that we added in the light of the 2010 election about central management. And this really goes to the heart of why we got the result we did in 2010. Because one of the stories of 2010, and one of the articles that we put on the reading list, was that 2010, bizarrely, represented a triumph for the Labour Party. Now you might say, is this a Labour apologist speaking? Is this a deluded Labour politician speaking? It's none of those things. The thing about Labour in 2010 was that they knew they were going to lose. So their strategy for campaigning was to forget about those seats that were going to fall anyway. They effectively abandoned those ultra-marginal seats, like Battersea, just near here. Instead, their strategy, their clear objective, was to deny the Conservatives a majority. And so they focused their attention not on trying to win an election they couldn't win, but on limiting the damage. And they were very successful at doing that. The example of the unclear objectives, ironically, are the Liberal Democrats in 2010. Because the Liberal Democrats pulled off a fantastic feat in 2010. They managed simultaneously to be too ambitious and too conservative. It's conservative with a small c. Too conservative because they regarded none of their seats as being safe. So they piled in lots of resource in seats they were going to win anyway. Too ambitious because they got caught up with Cleggmania and instead of focusing on their original set of targets, overextended themselves. And the result was they stretched themselves much too far relative to what they'd done in previous elections. And as you'll see if you've read the paper, Labour was the beneficiary. They managed to cut short some of the Liberal Democrat surge, which sort of melted away as we saw in the election. So, concluding thoughts. The first thing I think to ask ourselves, and we won't know the answer of course until 2015 and subsequently 2020, is whether or not 2010 represented the high point of multipartism at Westminster level. If the Liberal Democrats are falling back, as the data I showed you seem to suggest, then we may be moving back to a situation that was more reminiscent of the 1980s, with Labour and the Conservatives being the more dominant parties, the late 1980s. Secondly, electoral systems it seems, have some impact on voter choices, but perhaps not as much as we might expect. If you cast your minds back to the referendum, those people fronting the Yes campaign predicted all sorts of change if we had AV. And actually, the evidence doesn't suggest it would be as great as they suggested. Thirdly, the declining loyalties to parties means that short-term influences may be more influential. In other words, if people are less loyal, if they're more volatile, if they're making their minds up later, things like campaigning, things like leadership effects, leadership debates are more likely to have an effect. And we've seen that at constituency level in terms of the extent to which constituency campaigning yield electoral payoffs. And the irony is that although the Lib Dems, as you know, are very much in favour of electoral reform, 2010 aside, they've now really mastered how to fight elections under first past the post. And like other parties, they'd probably be all at sea if they had to campaign under a different system. And there you have it.
Right, excellent. Much food for thought there. And we've got a number of private questions, but those ready and waiting to ask questions here. So, Roman, you want to go first? Or
yeah, sure.
Yeah.
Hold on. I was thinking about electoral systems, and we saw that they don't necessarily reflect partisanship as being as strong as we thought. And my question was, in Scotland and especially Northern Ireland and Wales, PR has led to a rise in fractionalism between, voting share. But in the context of England, were there to be a system of PR, would the more homogeneous nature of the state mean that it would take longer for a difference to emerge, if not at all?
That's a very good question. In terms of speculation, I think the answer to that is probably yes, because there's not a ready-made fourth party in England such as there is in Scotland and Wales. So Plaid and the SNP already existed. There was scope for them to grow. We might point to UKIP as a possible fourth party fracturing that consensus, but I suspect you're right that it would take much longer in England than it would do in those other countries. Yes, I think that's an excellent point.
Okay, Jack.
With the 2011 AV referendum, which was quite convincingly defeated, I think that was a statement by the electorate that they're happy with first past the post, or just that they didn't like the other option of AV and would prefer a more proportional system? And on the back of that, do you think that given the increasing number of effective electoral parties, first past the post is becoming kind of increasingly unfit for purpose?
Okay, I think the first part to the answer to the question is that arguing against the status quo is always the most difficult thing in a referendum. But actually, I think the answer to the question about why voters rejected it is much more to do with the fact that the Yes campaign ran perhaps the most inept election campaign we've ever seen in British electoral politics. I don't say that in jest. I think the lesson for any of you who go into campaigning is the worst thing you can do if you're planning a campaign is speak to people with whom you already agree. And that's how the AV campaign was presented, the Yes to AV. So what were their slogans? It will make MPs work harder. Well, MPs already work harder than anybody in this entire building. Okay? So it will make CIS seats less safe. Almost certainly not. It was all sort of pie in the sky stuff. And actually, just down the road at UCL, I was on a panel when we were discussing this. And Billy Bragg was one of the speakers. Now, most of you are probably too young to remember Billy Bragg. Billy Bragg was a faintly successful singer in the 1980s who now sets himself up as a spokesman on reform. And he stood up and he said, there is just one more step here. If we get this, we can go proportional. Now, if you're not sure and you kind of quite like the status quo, the idea that it's a Trojan horse is probably not a very sensible move. And that was the whole tenet. The other thing is that the No campaign, whatever you think of them, whether you think the campaign was reasonable or not, was a brilliant negative campaign. Okay? If any of you remember the posters, their whole strategy was it's too complicated and it will cost a fortune. Now, whether or not it was too complicated is debatable. Whether or not it would cost a fortune is debatable. But there were billboards everywhere which said, they had a picture of a baby and it said, this baby needs a new maternity unit, not a new electoral system. Which, translated in sort of semiotics is, vote no or the baby dies. Okay? And there was a whole series of these things. Now, whatever you think about the ethics of that, it's a brilliant, brilliant campaign. And it was a clear example of, if you get a very clear message, you'll win the day. Coupled with that, in truth, most people don't care that much about the electoral system. So you've really got to convince them. You often see people, possibly from this institution, who argue that if you gave people a vote on the House of Lords, this would really inspire them. The truth is, most people don't care. In the same way that Europe is never in the top 10 of topics that interest people most. So in answer to your question, I think it's a combination of factors. I don't think a more proportional system would have been one that people would have voted for instead. This was a one-shot game. You can only vote for, you only had the choice of AV, and if you're in favour of reform, that was the only way you kind of should vote. But it was a whole host of things, not least the difficulty of voting against the status quo. And if we have a referendum on Europe, our continued membership of Europe, you're likely to see that same kind of messaging for those people who are defending the status quo. Fairly blunt messaging saying, leave the EU and kiss goodbye to all this money. Leave the EU, kiss goodbye to all these jobs, etc., etc. Whether or not they're ethically right, is neither here nor there. It's a strong message. So whatever you do, if you're on that campaign, if you're on the pro-Euro campaign or anti-Euro campaign, talk to your opponents and find out what pushes their buttons. That was the real lesson of 2011.
I mean, and going back to the question of your implied remark about people around here, I don't think I mean anyone in this room, but around this institution and the House of Lords. I mean, the cultural disconnect question. Yeah. I thought it was interesting, and I'd like your views on this, that a number of places that did vote yes to AV were in no particular order. Places where the University of London was heavily represented, Cambridge, Oxford, Glasgow, Kelvin, where I think Strathclyde, the universities are in and so on. They were Brighton.
Right.
Large concentrations of, dare I say, academics and students, I'm just guessing. And they did vote yes to AV, and that does suggest that it's an issue, as you've implied with the House of Lords reform, that a small number of people are very interested in, and a very large number of people only think about when they're asked about it.
Yeah. Yes, I mean, that's precisely. I mean, I could go further, but I think...
No, you're right.
Yeah.
Josh.
You've showed us some opinion polls, and they don't look great for the Liberal Democrats at all.
At present.
Sure, but if the trend continues. But you've also said how the Liberal Democrats are effective local campaigners, and how they're barmy army, of which I'm a conscript.
Good.
Fight them around everywhere and campaign effectively. So, do you think that this effective campaigning will be able to ensure that what the polls look like isn't reflected in 2015? Is there a light at the end of the tunnel? And is the light to the end of the tunnel? Is that a great result, or is it just a train coming down?
No, I think no. I mean, I think it's an excellent point, because I think the skill that the Liberal Democrats have is likely to minimise the losses. Okay, if they're sensible, they'll give up on a certain number of seats and just focus on the core, and so it doesn't fall. So they still have a respectable number. And I think with the organisation they have, they should be able to do it. The key problem that they have is that the Lib Dems, because they're a small organisation, had a chief executive who was fantastic at marshalling the troops. Now that chief executive, who wasn't chief executive at the last election, was still influential, had some local difficulty, and is no longer a core part of the Liberal Democrat strategy. So what they need to do is ensure that tightly controlled campaigning from the centre, directing people where to go and so on and so forth, continues. The downside for the Liberal Democrats is that as their number of councils has fallen, some of their activism may drop off. And that is partly a function of people becoming disillusioned when they lose, but also because you find that as people, that just in general, as parties lose, supporters become less inclined to get involved. It's the same sort of logic that sees smaller attendances when teams are facing relegation. I'm sorry to labour this football analogy, but I always point out to my students that politics is not something that's out there in a vacuum. It's just like real life. So, it is a problem for parties if they're on a losing streak. Now, I suspect the Liberal Democrats will be able to minimise the losses as far as possible. So I don't think, we're not looking at wipeout, but I do think that we may be looking at going back to a situation that was probably less good than it was in 1997. If these polls are correct. I mean, those of you who are veterans of Lib Dem or centre party politics will always be waiting for a late surge, and that's what was happening in 87 and so on. But I suspect it'll probably be better than the polls suggest if they get their act together on the ground, because it's ultimately seats that matter, not share of the vote.
I mean, this point about declining support, declining party membership. I mean, we've seen, I think last week or the week before, a chart showing declining party membership, really to contrast it with the growth in NGOs, the National Trust famously, and membership of other organisations. But the truth is that declining party membership, if it then contributes to a decline in the capacity to win councillors, then becomes potentially a death spiral, doesn't it? You see this in some constituencies where, say in London, where there used to be constituencies which were Conservative Labour marginals, which are now Labour Lib Dem marginals, and you referred to this, and there are others that go in both, the other two ways. And how far is sort of sustaining a number of councillors as a basis for activism important in sustaining active political life for a constituency at the national level, do you think?
It is important, but membership is perhaps not the variable to look at. And we've just published a paper on this, because in the last election, we asked agents how many people got involved in campaigns who weren't party members. And what we found was that in 75% of all campaigns, they involved people who hadn't signed up. So there appears to be, we've only got one election to work on, but looking at the extent of it, we'd be surprised if it only happened in 2010. There is a cohort of people who want to be involved in elections, and lots of them are Lib Dems. Actually, Lib Dems have been very good at attracting these sorts of people, who want to be involved, but don't want to sign up. They don't want to get the begging letters for money. Any of you who have given a party money or have been a member will know that they never forget you. And they'll ring you up. I gave a party some money in 1992, and they still ring me up to this day. So on the one hand, it is losing councillors matters because they, by definition, are activists, and often their families are. But it's not necessarily a problem if membership declines, because what parties seem to be doing is evolving, so they're less rigid organisations. In other words, if you were a Labour supporter, why on earth would you want to join? To go to crushingly boring meetings when the really exciting stuff is actually campaigning. And you can do that. Parties are welcoming these people with open arms. Indeed, the Conservative and Labour parties have a supporter database. So I think the death of parties has been overstated because they seem to be evolving, but certainly the declining councillors would suggest it could be bad news for the Liberal Democrats. But of course, if they have this army of people who are, still keen to support Liberal Democrat values, they may do better than we think.
Okay, would anybody else like to make a comment or ask a question? Yeah.
I'm just wanting to build on your point, really, Tony. The Tories themselves are starting to recognise their northern problem. And I think there was a YouGov poll in September that found that 57% of people in the north could only think of one or two people they knew who voted Tory or supported the Tories. Do you think that the Tories now have a sufficient grasp of central organisation to get the resources they need into the handful of northern marginals they have? Or do you think we can expect a sharp drop in the number of effective parties, both electoral and parliamentary, in the north, and particularly in light of the Lib Dem collapse we've seen in local elections in the region?
Can I add to that? That's a very interesting question. I mean, in places like Manchester, anybody here from Manchester? Any place like Manchester or Liverpool or Newcastle upon Tyne, where there are now no Conservative councillors, no Conservative MPs, I think, even though maybe one to just overlap, because constituencies overlap the city boundary. But where that's happened, I mean, there can't be no Conservative voters in the same way there are places in Buckinghamshire and in the south where there's no Labour representation, but there must be Labour voters. And it plays to what you were saying about, in a sense, how they may not know their first choice, but they know what their second and third are, and eventually will use their votes to, in a sense, to vote their least unfavoured way. Is that right?
Yeah. Yes. I mean, it's a tactical vote. Yeah. Well, the Conservatives certainly do recognise they've got a problem in the north of England. I'm not sure they've only just realised it. I think they've known it for a while. And of course, there are some parts of the north of England where there is Conservative representation, you know, in the sort of wealthier parts of Cheshire and so on and so forth. But the issue is that there are more people down south. And, you know, there are lots and lots of constituencies in the south of England. And particularly if, you know, one of the great worries for Labour would be if Scotland became independent, it would effectively lead to a permanent Conservative majority, or at least Labour being out of power for some considerable time. So I don't think they have necessarily got their act together, but I'm not sure it's necessarily you know, a new problem for the Conservatives. You know, clearly if they're going to do well, they need to win over parts of the north, but really the target areas are more the kind of Midlands, which are more of the swing areas. You know, there are some parts of the north that the Conservatives will never win, but they've probably got more chance around the Birminghams of this world rather than necessarily the Manchesters. Birmingham's Edgbaston's an interesting case. This was one of the ones that Labour cut off and thought it was going to lose. And it was only because of the efforts of the local MP, Gisela Stewart, that they managed to hold on. It was ultra-marginal. But that's really where the Conservatives should be making gains.
And Mr. Chair.
Do you think the number of independent MPs will rise?
No.
Why not?
Or indeed any UKIP. I mean, let's go beyond, because the early charts did suggest that, you know, eventually, notwithstanding the two-party system, there would be potentially a tipping point. Lib Dems never quite got to it, but there's a tipping point, isn't there, in the two-past opposed voting system?
Yeah.
Sorry.
Well, will there be the evidence? There's sort of mixed evidence on this. If we're taking UKIP, for example, parties such as UKIP do well at certain levels of government and do well when there are certain conditions in place that are beneficial, like a more proportional system or an issue that captures the imagination. So we fully expect UKIP to do extremely well in the European elections next year. They have managed to win seats at the GLA level because the electoral system allows it. But the evidence from previous elections, at least, is it's very, very difficult unless you've got an incredibly strong local base for a small party like that to make a breakthrough. So the Green MP in Brighton is novel because it's a very rare event, and that was an area of Green strength for some considerable period of time. They won the council there, of course. And the evidence is not really here yet that that UKIP have built up that base in key constituencies. So I would have thought it's unlikely that they'll win that because they haven't got the campaigning power in a general election. They will do well in European elections. In terms of independence, I mean, we had an example in 2001 and 2005 where Kidderminster Health Concern, a doctor stood and won a seat on a very pertinent local issue, and indeed he retained the seat even after they closed the hospital that he was campaigning against closure. But it soon reverted to type. We saw that with Martin Bell when he won the seat in Tatton. It was independent, and now it's George Osborne's seat. So you get very isolated successes, but typically they're rarely long-term, and typically they're very much the exception. So my suspicion is, and it depends, I have colleagues who work on UKIP, and they're predicting a breakthrough because they think they're picking up tips from the Lib Dems in terms of how to campaign. But it's having the base on the ground really makes a difference.
How do the voting patterns of immigrants compare to people who are born in UKIP?
Well, the limited evidence that there is on this, and I say it's limited because typically in order to do this in surveys you need what we call a booster sample in order to disaggregate between the various different groups. The limited evidence we've had suggests that, that people of Asian and African origin are disproportionately likely to vote Labour compared with other parties. However, in recent years, where we've been able to test that, you've started to see differentiation, particularly between people of Indian origin as opposed to people of Pakistani origin. So there's some suggestive evidence that people of Indian origin are now slightly more likely to vote for parties other than Labour. But in general, the population of Asians and Afro-Caribbeans tends to be disproportionately in favour of one party than another.
Okay, we're going to have to finish in a minute. Can I just put two of your points together, Justin? You talked about the commitment to party. You showed us clear evidence that commitment to party was declining over time, that there was evidence of commitment. And yet it's also possible that, and you made this point, that we might have gone past the high point of the anti-two-party vote, if you said, so that there might be a reversion to Conservative plus Labour voting in the 2015 general election. Now, if that happened, what would that tell us? If we got a reversion to, as it were, if let's assume that the commitment to party continued to weaken, and yet there also, certainly, and say commitment to the major parties continued to weaken, and yet there was a reversion to two-party voting, would that tell us something? I don't know, what would that tell us?
I'm not sure it would tell us a great deal, because we experienced a declining loyalty to parties and a reversion to two-partism in the late 80s to mid-90s. It would suggest that people were less committed to the parties than they once were, but of the choices available, they were plumping for those two.
We must finish now. I just say thank you. I mean, thank you for a great lecture. Second, don't worry about the football analogy. I don't know if anybody in the audience was at the Peacock Theatre for Boris Johnson last night. Have any of you heard that? Because, where he managed to get involved in a wonderfully tangled metaphor, forgive me if I get this wrong, I think it was about the banks being something like a kind of giant squid on the face of the government or something, wasn't it? And it was so complicated that anybody could understand it. It was certainly less complicated than your football analogy. So thank you again, Justin. Thank you very much.
My pleasure.